So thank you for being with us for this month's ONA highlight. My name is Brent Sellers. I'm the Extension Weed Specialist here at the Range Cattle REC and also the Center Director. And also today we have a guest speaker with us, really our expert on grass weed ID or grass plant ID. Shouldn't call them all weeds at this point. But Marc is our extension botanist with the University of Florida Herbarium. He'll start off today talking about how to identify several of the species that are in the state and a couple that are up and coming. And then I will end with some management techniques, what we know at this point in time. So Marc, I'll turn it over to you.
Nice to see you all. I'm actually surprised to see this many people in the room. I had no idea what to expect. It's probably because of the good smelling food in back, which you guys online can't smell, but it smells amazing. So Brent wanted a sexy title, and the sexiest title I could come up with is Grasses Gone Bad, because I was thinking like the Bad Housewives kind of mode. So let me tell you a little bit. Brent calls me the grass ID expert, which is a bit of a stretch. Okay, so I work at the UF Herbarium, and in case you don't know it, a herbarium is like a library of preserved plant specimens. And the library at the University of Florida is the oldest, the largest, and the most comprehensive collection of plant pest specimens in the state. It was actually established at Florida Agricultural College, which was the original land-grant university in the state of Florida and the site of the very first agricultural experiment station. So the founder of the UF Herbarium was Peter Rolfs, who was also director of the Florida Agricultural Experiment Station around the turn of the century. So you can see example of a herbarium specimen there on the left that was collected by Peter Rolfs in 1892. So people say you can have dried plants that last that long. Absolutely, you can have plants that long. We have specimens dating back to the 1840s from Florida. And if you just take a moment to imagine in your mind what Florida was like in the 1840s with very little development, very low population, no paved roads, it was a whole different environment. So it's really interesting to have this historical record of what Florida looked like in the past, but also when we're talking about cultivated plants, to have a sense of when things were introduced over time. And with herbarium specimens, we can actually sample the genetics to look at population genetics of introductions over time. Okay, so the UF Herbarium collection consists of about half a million specimens. We have dried fungi, mosses and their relatives, ferns, cycads and conifers, and all the flowering plants, a wood collection, a seed collection, and a really extensive library. And so this collection really is intended to document the diversity of all the plants that occur in the state, and that includes the native plants, the cultivated plants for all different purposes, everything from forage plants to, ornamentals to fruit and vegetable crops, and also the plants that have been introduced for various reasons and escaped into the wild. As I mentioned, we do have specimens dating back to the 1840s, and the collection is constantly growing. So you can see a specimen there on the right side of the slide that is Indian cup scale that was collected by the then Ag and Natural Resources Extension Agent in Bradford County. And that was a new record for the state. So we rely on you guys, what you're seeing in your pastures and the extension agents that you are working with to report things that seem atypical. And it's really good to document it with a physical specimen, because when we're all dead and gone, then other people are going to refer back to these specimens and often be able to get at points of introduction or genetics of material that is being introduced. Okay, so I'm just here to tell you, grass ID is tough. I do not claim to be an expert at it. It's really, really hard. The grass family is one of the largest plant families worldwide, and it's also one of the biggest in Florida, with about 121 different genera and about 460 different species. And new species are being recognized, or some species are being split apart. So we're seeing a steady increase in the number of species for multiple reasons, also through new introductions. So most of the characteristics that are used for a confident identification grasses are aspects of that seed head. They're what you're seeing on the lower right part of the slide is the spikelet, which is the individual flowering unit. And when you're going to a book like David Hall's Grasses of Florida or the Guide to the Vascular Plants of Florida, it is talking about measurements in the scale of fractions of millimeters and microscopic aspects of those spikelets. So when you're talking about differentiating different species of Paspalum or Panacetum or whatever, the characteristics that the botanists are using are based on microscopic features. So the bottom line is, if you have a grass that you are trying to get identified and you're going through your local extension agent or going through Brent, you really want to wait until that grass has a seed head, until it's fertile. And photos might get me to a genus level or get me to a guess, but it is very rare that I can ever make a confident ID on a grass based on a photo. A lot of times, the more I look at them, the more I can get hunches, but I'm never confident in saying, yes, for sure, it is X, until I see that physical flowering sample under a microscope. So conversely, if you've got a grass that doesn't have a seed head, it hasn't flowered or fruited yet, 9 times out of 10, we might look at it and come up with an idea of what it is, but rarely can we confidently tell you for sure an ID until we've got that seed head present. So specifically today, we're talking about invasive grasses, and just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what we really mean by invasive. An invasive is a non-native species that may have been introduced intentionally or accidentally. And these species that are introduced are expanding in the wild. They're displacing native species. They're altering the ecology of natural communities, and that can be like with Kogan grass, where you have a lot of thatch, and then when fire moves through the ecosystem, and fire might be a natural part of the ecosystem, but with the thatch of the Kogan grass, it burns a lot hotter, so it ends up killing the pines and the other things that should be adapted to fire because it's a faster, hotter fire. Or it might alter the hydrology of the environment, like if you think about Brazilian pepper and melaleuca down in the Everglades that sucked up the water of this wetland ecosystem. So that's what I mean by altering the ecology of a natural ecosystem. Of course, invasive plants also cause economic losses. And for you guys, that usually means a reduction in agricultural productivity. And then they could cause harm to human health. So there's plenty of invasive insect pests and pathogens that have been introduced to the state that can result in human disease and death. Just think COVID, non-native. I mean, basically, if you talk to the disease people, they'd consider it invasive. Okay, so what are the characteristics of invasive plants? Generally, they tolerate a wide variety of habitats and growing conditions. They're basically super adaptable. They grow and reproduce rapidly. That allows them to compete really aggressively with the other plants in the environment for resources like space, light, water, and nutrients. And they usually, because they're introduced from a different place, they lack natural enemies that keep them under control. So in their native environment, there's usually things that have co-evolved with them that keep them under control, or there are environmental conditions that might keep them under control. But when they get introduced to a new place, then they run wild. And with invasive plants, we often first observe them in the disturbed habitats that us humans are so good at creating. So think roadsides, people's home landscapes, cultivated places, pastures. But what happens is those disturbed areas act as a reservoir for invasive species, and then they gradually move into less disturbed wild habitats where we see more ecological impacts. And so there's been a lot of data supporting the idea that there tends to be a 70 to 80-year lag period between the time that a non-native species is introduced and starts to spread and the time that we really observe noticeable impacts. So we're going to see that when I'm talking about these 5 grasses that I want to familiarize you with, and I'm going to tell you the dates of introduction, the earliest herbarium specimens, and then sure enough, with each of them, we're seeing that now it's 80 to 100 years later, and we're starting to see the spread of them into undisturbed habitats, which is of a lot of concern for the people who are managing our native lands and managing native species, besides the impacts that it has for agricultural productivity. Okay, so Brent and I kind of put our heads together and talk about, well, what are most people familiar with? What are people not familiar with? So we figured we wouldn't bother talking to you about Kogan grass, torpedo grass, or rose natal grass, but I just want you guys to see on these maps from the Atlas of Florida plants how extensively distributed these species are across the state. And so these maps show all the counties for which there is actually a pressed specimen in some herbarium. And so you can see with all of these non-native species, they're practically everywhere. And where you see gaps of white counties doesn't mean it's not necessarily there. It just means no one's gotten around to submitting a specimen that we can press and put in an herbarium. So with both of them, the bets are that they're in pretty much every darn county in the state. Okay, so these are the well-known bad boys that you, or bad girls, depending on your preference, that you guys probably are familiar with, and you probably already have some information in your wheelhouse about how to deal with them. So I'm going to talk about 5 other species that seem to me to be on the increase, and my the way that I'm getting at that is through requests that are coming to me from ag extension agents across the state, because what I do as in the herbarium is provide IDs for everyone in the county level offices and at the RECs like this one. And so if I'm getting a lot of requests to identify certain species and looking at the distribution maps and seeing each time I get a new one, it's another county, I'm like, we got to put this on the radar. So these are the 5 that Brent and I came up with. And the first is something that you guys have not seen, because you can see that Bothriochloa blattii, which is commonly known as Australian beard grass or Caucasian blue stem, it is native to the tropical parts of the old world. So Africa, Asia, through the Pacific into Australia. But you can see in the upper map, the green is the native range, the purple is the introduced range. And so it's now been introduced and escaped into South America, up into Central America, the southwestern US, and Florida. And here within Florida, as I'm going to mention in just a second, we have records showing that it was introduced as early as the 1940s by our old IFAS agronomist at the Ag Experiment Station, George Ritchie, had it in his experimental plots in the 1940s. And now all the areas surrounding Alachua County are getting this Bothriochloa blattii. And so I'm going to actually step away from the microphone for a second, because I have a sample of this plant and I'm going to get it started so y'all can just pass it and get a visual feel. There's two things I'd like you to notice about this. One is the reddish coloration, which is very distinctive. This grass tends to bloom between late summer and winter. If you're in a mild climate, then it may survive the winter and you may have seed heads perpetuating like I found here on campus because we've had a very mild winter in Gainesville. So when it comes into bloom, it's very distinctive because you get this reddish purple color, and it really does well in dry, disturbed habitats. And so that, of course, includes unirrigated fields, pastures, roadsides. We just kind of started sounding the alarm because each successive year I'm getting 1 or 2 new county vouchers for this species from North Central Florida. So we asked the folks at the UF IFAS assessment to run it through their predictive tool, and they found that this species has a high invasion risk. So as a result of that, what I'm guessing is when the Florida Invasive Species Council people meet, and they're a committee of people that meet on an annual basis, that sooner or later, this is also going to find its way onto the Florida Invasive Species Council list. So to recognize Australian beardgrass, it's a perennial species, and it's got short, hard rhizomes, and a rhizome is a little horizontal underground stem that allows it to perpetuate from year to year. It's basically a storage organ that lets it hold on to carbohydrates in the dry season or the winter season. I've had a number of people tell me, particularly people who during landscape maintenance or mowing roadsides, that when we get late in the season, that they really notice a smell, and it's kind of an odd smell. It's a little musky and a little bit like beef gravy. It's really weird. So when you cut it and you smell it, and at this time of year, I didn't really perceive a noticeable smell on it. And so there may be some chemical component that's building up with the heat in that late summer to fall season, but it is definitely distinctive when you smell it. The nodes along the stems are pubescent. They have these soft hairs. The panicles, the seed heads, come out in autumn. They are red at maturity. Some people think it's purple. To me, it looks red. They usually have 7 to 18 branches. And one of the things that allows you, because we've got at least 6 different species of Bothriochloa chloa in the state of Florida, what allows us to distinguish Australian beardgrass from the other Bothriochloa chloa species is that the individual branches on that inflorescence, on that seed head, are shorter than the total length of the seed head. And so what I'm finding is that there's actually a lot of confusion between this species, Australian beardgrass, and 2 other species, which is the pitted beardgrass and the King River bluestem. They are both other species of Bothriochloa chloa. And those 2 species are more widely distributed in Florida. And so now I'd really like to go back and start looking at some of those specimens and making sure that this Australian, that what's been identified as those other 2 species really is, and that this Australian beardgrass isn't yet expanded out of North Central Florida. But for you guys that are down here, I would definitely like for you to keep your eyes out for this distinctive coloration when we get into late summer to fall. Our hypothesis is that this is probably spreading on commercial mowing equipment. And so we're seeing a gradual expansion, particularly in roadsides, but then once it gets into roadsides, it's moving in people's pastures and ag production. The spikelets, the individual flowering units, the form that we have here in Florida usually has a distinctive pit, which you can see in the photo on the far right. And in the uppermost spikelets, they usually have these needle-like projections or awns that are kind of corkscrew twisted and also bent like your elbow or a knee. So it's kind of a distinctive set of characteristics for recognition. Australian beard grass, keep your eyes out for it. The other grass that I really feel like is emerging and people are getting more aware of is Brunswick grass. This is a species of Paspalum. It has traditionally been called Paspalum nicorii, but some botanists have suggested that there is an older name, Paspalum lepton, that is the correct and preferred name, but most horticulturists, agriculturists, botanists haven't accepted it. So you might see either name. The Atlas of Florida Plants is still using the name Paspalum nicorii. You can see its native distribution in green is in South America, and its introduced distribution is basically the Gulf Coast of the southern US, extending from Louisiana east to Georgia and down into Florida. Now, this species hasn't been evaluated yet by the UF IFAS assessment, and as soon as they get a new staff person hired on, I'm going to be encouraging them to do so. And it hasn't been evaluated by the Florida Invasive Species Council. But look at this distribution map. You can see it's been found up in the Panhandle, and I'm getting reports from people that it's more widespread on the Panhandle than that one Greene County would indicate. And then down most of the length of the peninsula, and Ann Blunt worked with Brent and Marcello and a number of other people to publish an extension document that is giving the characteristics for this grass and arguing that it really is invasive and that the route of introduction is probably as a contaminant in Bahia grass seed. And so there's a couple routes of approach. One of them is to get it to the point where people are aware enough that then the people at FDACS are actually doing inspection of seed lots that are coming in and looking for this Paspalum nicorii seed. In terms of recognizing Brunswick grass, it looks a lot like a native species of Paspalum called brown seed Paspalum. They look super similar with a brown spikelet or seed head. But what sets Brunswick grass apart is what you're seeing in the upper image, which makes these long, deep rhizomes. Again, a rhizome is a horizontal underground stem that allows it to become perennial. And they're really aggressive. And honestly, I had heard Ann Blunt talking about Paspalum nicorii for a couple of years, and I had seen tops of plants, but I'd never really seen root system. And then our livestock agent in Alachua County, Cindy Sanders, brought in a sample that a client had dug out from their pasture. And so it had, you know, a big clump of dirt in a box, and I was able to tease the dirt away. And I was like, holy moly, it was just this network of all of these branching rhizomes. It was so extensive. And then I thought, oh, that's why it's taking over people's pastures, because once it gets established, it just runs extensively via these rhizomes. Some of the other characteristics for recognizing it are that the base of the leaf sheets are usually pubescent, and they have long, stiff hairs along the upper margins of the leaf sheet. And the seed head, the inflorescence, is a panicle that usually has 3 to 5 branches. You can tell it apart from the Bahia grass, which usually has 2 to 3 branches, usually not more than 3. And then, of course, by the color of the spikelets, which is that dark kind of chestnut brown with a tan edge. And as far as I know, the only other Paspalum that is in the state of Florida that has that coloration to the mature spikelets is the brown seed Paspalum, which does not have the rhizomes. So if you've got the brown spikelets and the rhizomes, chances are you've got Brunswick grass. Okay, our next bad boy, West Indian marsh grass, Hymenacne amplexicaulis. It is native, you can see, to most of the old world from India east into Eastern and Central Asia and down into Australia. And no, I'm sorry, it's native to South America into Central America and then introduced in Florida and the Old World. The IFAS assessment has evaluated this species and found that it's widespread enough that they think it is invasive. And the Florida Invasive Species Council has also declared this species invasive. So you can see its voucher distribution in Florida, which is primarily central and southern peninsula, but extending a little bit into North Florida. When I see things in Alachua County and up here near Leon County, it's telling me that usually it's associated with ag experiment that was happening at UF or FSU. But my question is whether West Indian marsh grass can really survive our winters in North Florida. So there may be a cold tolerance thing that's going to limit how far north it can spread. This is a wetland species. It's perennial and it gets these long, thick, flopping stems. And so this is the one other grass that I have a sample of, which I'm going to circulate around for the audience to see. What I'd like for you guys to notice as this passes around is it's got this thick stem, I would say at least pencil thick, up to a fat finger thick, very distinctive and rooting at the nodes. It is primarily found in wetland sites, which you would assume with marsh grass, but not too long ago, I got a sample from an ag agent in Flagler County, and it was a dry pasture. He said it was a dry pasture, but it was surrounded by ditches, and it had actually successfully moved from the ditches into the pasture. So I think with a sufficient amount of seasonal rainfall, it can move into a dry area, though it's typically associated with wet areas. That name, amplexicale, means wrapping around the stem. And so what you can see in the lower photo, second over from the right, is that the bases of the leaves have these little ears that wrap around the stem. It's very distinctive. The only other species that we have of hymenacne in Florida is our native maiden cane, which used to be called Panicum hemitomen, and it looks similar, but it doesn't have those thick white pith stems. It doesn't have as dense of an inflorescence, and it doesn't have the clasping leaf bases. So that's a good suite of characters for recognizing marsh grass. When you look at the seed heads, they're really distinctive. To me, it looks like a plume or kind of foxtail thing. It's dense. It's actually made up of individual branches, but they're so densely arranged that it looks like they're all on a single axis. So very distinctive inflorescence, very distinctive grass that's easy to recognize, and very few things that you might confuse it with. Now, another wetland grass is peargrass, Uricloa mutica. And again, the IFAS assessments evaluated this species, found it's invasive, and the Florida Invasive Species Council also considers it invasive. It is native to tropical Africa, but introduced to tropical and subtropical areas worldwide. And you can see its distribution in Florida. It's pretty uniform across the central and southern part of the peninsula, extending up along the east coast, so warmer coastal areas. That Escambia County record is kind of interesting. I wonder if that's near the coast and it's a warmer habitat. If Laura Bennett is logged in, or anyone who's in Pasco, Hernando, up into Nature Coast, I would definitely keep an eye out for an expansion of this species into your area, particularly in warmer areas that are closer to the coast. For recognizing peargrass, it is a sprawling grass, much like the previous one that we looked at, the West Indian marsh grass, but it doesn't have the really thick stems that root as extensively at the nodes. It's got more surface horizontal stems or stolons that form mats, particularly in waterlogged soils, but occasionally moving into dry soils. The leaf bases are also different. They tend to be truncate or cut off instead of wrapping around the stem like you see in the West Indian marsh grass. The panicles have from 8 to 20 branches, and the seed heads are very distinctive. They're elliptic, so widest near the center, and they tend to be a green color that flushes with red or purple. So it's a pretty distinctive grass. And again, if you're in a wet site and you've got something that is mat forming and spreading, the first two things I'd consider would be paragrass and the previous one, West Indian marsh grass. And then last but not least, okay, Brent, how do you pronounce the common name on this? Haragua? Okay, does anyone say Haragua? Okay, when I looked online, I saw people calling it Haragua. I talked to a friend who's Portuguese from Brazil, and she said it's Charagua. So you might hear it anyway. I will go with giant thatching grass because then you don't have to deal with pronunciation. But no, you will see Jaragua or Charagua grass. This has also been found to be a high invasion risk by the IFAS assessment. The Florida Invasive Species Council says it's a Category 2 invasive. You can see that its native range is tropical Africa. I question this map. It's showing green for Southeast Asia, and some other resources I look at say it's really introduced in Asia. I think it's pretty exclusively African, but introduced to tropical to subtropical areas worldwide. This grass in Florida from Alachua County southward, I'm expecting in this part of the state that we should be seeing more records of it. I feel like this is a sampling issue in that south central and central part of the state where we're not green. I would expect its distribution to be pretty similar to what we saw on the previous Eurocloa slide, where it's pretty much all a central and south. So keep your eyes out for this giant thatching grass. It is a big grass. It's erect, and it's usually tufted, and it can make clumps as tall as 9 feet tall, though typically a little smaller. Everything I'm reading about it says it's particularly aggressive after burning. So if an area is subjected to burning, it does something that releases the apical dominance, and it just really spreads via the rhizomes. It has yellow to reddish inflorescences that consist of a pair of racemes subtended by bract. And it's usually got a pretty distinctive reddish coloration to it, particularly when it's coming into maturity, which you can see in the lower right image. And the awns at the top of the spikelets tend to be twisted and bent, like I was talking about on the very first one. The Australian beard grass also has twisted and bent. But on this one, it's a very different shape to the inflorescence, and these awns are much longer. Now, with all of these, I'm just going to tell you what I came up with Australian beard grass. Interestingly, USDA documents 236 different introductions dating back to 1906. And our first record in the UF Herbarium is from the 1940s, from a cultivated context, a forage context. With the Brunswick grass, the USDA has 40 records of germplasm introductions dating back to the 1940s, and UF also has one from George Ritchie's agronomic plots in 1948. For the West Indian marsh grass, there are no, this is the really curious one. There's no USDA germplasm introductions, but there's a lot of talk that people think that livestock like it, that it's a good forage grass. So the hypothesis is that it may have been introduced as a potential forage. Our earliest herbarium record of the West Indian marsh grass is from 1957 from Palm Beach County from a pasture. And it doesn't say whether it was intentionally planted or whether it's an invader in that pasture. With the paragraphs, the USDA has introduction records dating back all the way to 1899 from Jamaica and 1908 from Brazil. So over 100 years history of introduction. And the Herbarium has records from Manatee County from the 1920s and from the UF forage plots from the 1920s. So again, been here 100 years. And lastly, with the Haragua or then USDA has records from Brazil dating to 1899, and UF has an Alachua County pasture specimen dating to 1922. So all of these things have been here a long time, and they've kind of flown under the radar, and now we've hit that 80-year plus. And we are seeing that expansion that I'm talking about. And that's why I'm saying that these are emerging species. It's not like they're new introductions, but they're hitting that threshold where the populations are larger. There may be some hybridization that are making them more vigorous so that they're moving out into natural areas. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Brent. And I'm sorry I took too much time.
All right, thank you, Mark. I always joke with people, if you look at the voucher specimen maps that Mark was showing, it has all the green counties. A lot of times Hardy County is white. I always joke that it's just because I've done that good of a job since I've been here. Yeah, right. It's just like Mark said, it's just people haven't turned in specimens to have them vouched from this part of the state. So I can make this really short, or I can make this last about another 20 minutes, but I'll make it in between. Basically, for invasive grasses, we have two products. It's either glyphosate or Invasive. Both of them are pretty much non-selective. You have to look at the labels to figure out where they can be used, because some of them are labeled strictly for terrestrial, some of them are labeled for aquatic as well. In general, I like to tell people that glyphosate, if you're using that, retreatment is going to be necessary, regardless of whether it's terrestrial or aquatic applications. But usually more so in aquatic situations, especially with torpedo grass. With that plant submerged, it typically doesn't translocate lower into the plant where you have to actually get the kill. With the Invasive, retreatment's also probably going to be likely, but it's not going to have to be as often because Invasive has some residual activity, unlike glyphosate. All right, so what I'm going to do is go through the individual species fairly quickly. Some of them we've done some work on here in Florida, others we have not. So I'm using data from outside resources. And there's not much information on Haragua. Glyphosate 2 to 3% volume to volume. In Australia, they're recommending 2%. So short story on that one. Crowgrass. So this is one that we have done some work, and I'm going to show you some pictures on this one in a minute. 6 pints per acre of glyphosate. Best applied to lush growth or new growth. So a lot of times where you see this growing, they'll have a lot of thatch. So burning would be helpful in this. Mowing, not so much, because we're going to leave a lot of thatch on top, and the crowgrass isn't going to go through it very rapidly. You will have to retreat escapes regardless. And then the Invasive would be 2 to 4 pints per acre. And with the Invasive, know that there are 2 different formulations or several different formulations, but there's like an Arsenal and there's an Arsenal AC. Arsenal AC is applicator's concentrate. It's double the concentration. So be aware of that when you're purchasing Invasive products, if there can be different concentrations. All right, so did some work over in the headwaters of St. John's River. They actually have a lot of impoundments over near Fellsmere, 50 to 100 acre impoundments, and we had the opportunity to go do some work there. So we had 2 impoundments that we worked on. We burned both of them. So this is about a week after it was burned. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see some new growth of crabgrass coming from the soil there. So we put different treatments on both the impoundments of glyphosate and imazapyr, and one impoundment was able to be flooded immediately. The other one we couldn't flood just because of pumping restrictions. And curiously, regardless of what we sprayed, the impoundment that got flooded immediately, we had very little regrowth come back. So that was really interesting. In the other impoundment, we could actually see treatment differences between glyphosate and imazapyr. So this was really cool. This is one of those stories that you can say, well, you can spray, you can burn, sorry, say that backwards, burn and then spray. If you're able to flood it, if you're able to pump water onto the system, like they were here, you may not even need a herbicide if you can burn it and get the water over the top of the storms. So this is what one of the impoundments looked like about a year later. We had to retreat some escapes here and there, but overall it worked fairly well. My next species is Brunswick grass. So this is going to be the exception. Yes, glyphosate and imazapyr do work on this, but in pastures, especially Bahia grass seed production fields, we did find that Valpar or hexazinone is quite effective on Brunswick grass. It can take 2 to 3 years of applications to manage it. This was a compilation of 4 different sites up in Sumter and Citrus counties. And basically one site, it only took us 1 year. Another site, it took us 2 years to get rid of 90% of it. And the other site, it took us 3 years to get over 90% control. But this is just an average of those sites. So essentially, if you're putting out at least 2 pints per acre of hexazinone annually over a 2 to 3 year period, you're probably going to be able to manage this species quite well. Interestingly, it doesn't seem to be as sensitive to rainfall as smut grass is. So we also use this product for smut grass, and that's how we came to know that hexazinone has activity on Brunswick grass, because somebody was trying to control smut grass and they noticed that they're also controlling the Brunswick grass. And this is 3 weeks after treatment at 3 pints per acre. See pretty rapid death of the top growth. And then if you would dig this up, you would actually see desiccation of the rhizomes as well. So West Indian marsh grass, pretty much the same as crabgrass as far as herbicides go. We also saw the same thing with water. If you're able to burn this and flood it immediately, you can keep West Indian marsh grass at bay for a bit. With imazapyr, and you'll see this and some other data later on down the road, not today, but we are seeing some definite species selectivity. We have a lot of native species coming back, even in imazapyr treated plots when it's applied during the wet season. The last one, Australian beard grass. So we don't have a lot of data. Actually, we don't have any data of this species as far as management goes in Florida at this point in time. The data I'm showing here is from Kansas State University. And just wanted to point out, so this is in pounds per acre on the top. So a quarter pound, half, 3/4, and a pound. So a quarter pound would be about 16 ounces of material per acre. All right, so we're normally recommending up to a pound per acre when we're going after non-selective control. There's some data that came out of the Phosphate Research Institute that shows that Bahia grass is actually fairly tolerant up to a half pound, sometimes up to 3/4 of a pound. So that is something we're actually trying with Kogan grass right now, trying to selectively remove Kogan grass out of Bahia grass, where Kogan grass is just starting to invade a pasture. So this is actually kind of interesting that they're getting fairly decent control or knockback with a quarter of a pound going from 30 plants or 30% cover of Australian beard grass to 10% with a quarter a pound. I think that's pretty impressive for this herbicide. So this is something that we're actually going to be looking at with some extension agents up in North Florida this year and hoping to get some preliminary data and carry it forward, not only on Australian beard grass, but also Kogan grass, and submit a larger grant for that. So I think overall, if we can prevent it, we're going to be much better off. So I think this is going to be really important for Australian beard grass. We know it's pretty localized right now, or we think, Mark, we think it's pretty localized. If we can prevent it from moving further, we can probably get a handle on it, but we may be already too late. Scout for regrowth. A lot of these species have rhizome stolons where they overwinter quite effectively. So more than likely, it's going to take more than one treatment to control them. And with that, I think we're ready to take questions. Mark, you can come up back up here so you're closer to the microphone. And for those of you that are online, when you close out today, there will be a survey. We would really appreciate if you will answer those questions. All right. Any questions from in the room? Joe.
So, plants in general, no one's paying me to recommend an app, but the way apps work is they compare a database of images with your unknown that you've uploaded. So it follows that the bigger the database that it's comparing it with, and the more global it is, the better the likelihood you'll get a match. And so at this point, it seems like iNaturalist is the best app. But having said that, I look at records on iNaturalist that are misidentified all the time. So people upload photos and iNaturalist suggests an ID, but it's not correct. So particularly with grasses, again, it's going on broad characteristics, and the real identifying characteristics are those microscopic and metric. So it's pretty dicey with grasses. So with Boswellia cloablatii, the Australian beard grass, iNaturalist is showing some records down here in this part of the state, but when I go look at them, I'm not seeing that long axis relative to the branches. So I think the app has misidentified them. So just caution with grass that it might start you off. I have a question for you.
Oh boy.
Okay, with every one of these grasses, they were introduced as a potential forage, and usually palatable when young, but then they outcompete whatever the intentional forage is. So to what extent can selective mowing to keep them fresh and leafy, or browsing at a certain time of year be used, or does that just set them loose and make them run and expand? Because all of these things, when I look at the data, I look at the databases online about forage grasses, all of these are listed.
That's a good question. So if you think about, I'm going to use smutgrass as an example because that's what I've worked mostly on, right?
Okay.
So I think there's enough data out there that shows if you mow smutgrass and seeds are there, you're doing worse because they're spreading it by seed. I would suggest that the same thing would happen with Australian beard grass because it seems to be a pretty prolific seed producer as well. But I mean, you can mow smutgrass in 2 weeks, have seed produced that quickly, regardless of the time of year. Don't know about Australian.
Yeah, so I actually wrote down but didn't tell you guys, David Hall's Grasses of Florida book actually has the flowering season for each of these species. And Australian beard grass, it was a pretty limited, like 3-month, 4-month period. So my idea was, okay, can you mow it before that starts, like early summer to midsummer? and keep it young and leafy enough that it's palatable and not producing those defects.
I think it's possible with some species, but we really have to look at it. So it's interesting because I've reached out to my friends in Australia that have Australian beard grass.
And
over
it's
there.
native there,
And
right?
It's native and they use it as one of their native grazing grasses.
Right.
So,
And the thing is, there's a ton, that was the one that had 236 different USDA germplasm records from everywhere, from Russia, from Asia, down into Australia. And so there's probably a lot of difference in how aggressive and also in terms of palatability and nutritional content, I'm guessing, depending on which form from what geographic location.
any other questions from the room or online? Okay, just a couple more things for people that are online, if I can get there. Our next ONA highlight will be on Tuesday, April 9th with Maria Silvera and with an update on biosolids research. And if you're not following us, there's several ways to do so with our website and our social media accounts, with our newest one being Instagram. And then if you're interested in weekly updates, join our mail list at ona.ifas.ufl.edu. So I had some other updates, but apparently they did not make it to this slide set, so I apologize for that. One of them will be held in April here at the Center of Ranching Foundations, so be looking on our website for that, and a herd health seminar in Arcadia coming up as well. So with that, everyone online, thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you next month.